Good morning and welcome to Human Geography 9B. We are going to start our class with Unit 5. You did your first 4 units in Human Geography 9A, and we are going to start with our unit on culture. And we're going to start with what is culture, and then we're going to focus on language, eventually moving into religion, but not today. So, Unit 5, essential questions 1 through 4. What's the difference between folk and popular culture? We'll talk a little bit about the major characteristics of the English language and how languages are related to one another, and how do languages then lead to conflict. So here we go. All right, what is culture? Right? Our definition of culture is materials, values, political institutions that make up a society. We look at culture as a collection of customs, right? For example, handshaking, right, as a greeting, or perhaps bowing as a greeting, or maybe a kiss on the cheek as greeting, right? So we look at customs, things like that. Here's a definition for you: taboo, things that are not allowed or improper or unacceptable. Often connected to religion, sometimes connected to food. So think Islam with the forbidding of alcohol or the forbidding of eating pork. All right, and then we have 2 major types of culture. We divide culture into 2 things: folk or local culture and popular culture. All right, folk is going to be small, it's going to be very isolated, and it's going to be very local. So think in terms of a village or small quaint customs that generally exist in less developed countries, whereas pop is going to be very large, it's going to be very widespread, and it can be global in its appeal, and think of that as coming from more developed countries. All right, so major characteristic differences between the two. In this chart, you will see, again, small, homogeneous, only existing in one ethnic group, right? Very local, existing in less developed countries, and very isolated. So think rural as well. In popular culture, though, we're going to look at large. We're going to see it multicultural or heterogeneous. We're going to see it as much more urban and existing more in MDCs than in LDCs. Right? Whatever we're talking about, whether that's architecture or food or clothing, in folk culture, the origins of things like folk music are going to be anonymous. We don't really know who wrote the song "Row, Row, Row Your Boat," right? But we know that it related to daily life at the time. Whereas in pop culture, we have known creators. Any of your pop music has authors, has songwriters, has singers, right? And there are known hearths, like, for example, the hearth of country music would be Nashville. All right, so methods of diffusion, we look at relocation diffusion. People take their folk culture with them when they move from place to place, whereas pop culture spreads through hierarchical diffusion from positions of power, from places of power, through communication, mass communication, through the internet, through technology. Right? The role of women in folk culture tends to be subservient. Whereas in pop culture, women have an opportunity for expanded opportunities. But keep in mind that it's not that popular culture portrays women particularly well, because we still have those gender stereotypes running through that. All right, it is connected to the environment. Folk culture is much more connected to the environment because it takes place on a small local scale, whereas pop culture is going to be much more destructive. Materials are going to be imported. Think McDonald's as an example, right? McDonald's, everything has to be the same, so it has to come from one spot, so we see more pollution. We see materials all coming from one spot. We see animals coming from place to be raised too. Right, good examples we look at. The Amish are a great example of folk culture in the United States. We see folk music. The idea of bugs being used as food might also be a folk culture tradition. Whereas in pop culture, we see Apple products, your local pop star, whatever flavor of the week that person is. Probably not Bieber so much anymore. And then food like McDonald's. right? So think about the pros and cons, folk culture and pop culture, and then also know that when folk and pop culture come together, pop culture tends to win, right? It tends to be this kind of wave of things that people are more likely to wear blue jeans once they're exposed to blue jeans than they are to wear their quaint little tribal get up, whatever that might be, right? If we take a look at hierarchical diffusion, we see this here is televisions on the left, right, in the orange, and we see in 1954 to 2005, so about 50 years here, you see how it starts in here and moves from to being global in its scope. Right, 1995 we have internet users, right, and we see in only 1995 in only 15 years as opposed to 50. Talk about widespread and how quickly this happens. We look at internet becoming widespread and global in only 15 years as opposed to 50 for televisions. So how can popular culture be a threat to folk traditions? Right, so we have this idea of cultural imperialism, where we look at maybe we use the term placelessness, where everything tends to look the same. That if pop culture exists across time and space and everywhere, then everything is going to look closer to the same as it did the opposite of that is if everybody has their local customs and traditions, right? We also see dominance of Western ideals. That we see this coming from transnational corporations, and we don't necessarily see a whole lot of diversity of where it is coming from. We see empowerment of women, which is sometimes a threat to local culture. We also see Western control of the media. And if we think about where our media comes from, it generally comes from the United States, Europe, or Japan. It doesn't necessarily come from other spots, right? So that sometimes come in conflict with social customs, and sometimes governments like North Korea, for example, or some Southwest Asian governments will ban, right? They'll censor what's going on from there. All right, so which of the following is a threat to folk culture? Is it a strong connection to the environment, subservient role of women, Western control of the media, or being isolated? And the answer to that is C. All right, what is the basics of language? So we covered our pop and folk culture rather quickly, and the rest of this is going to be dedicated to talking about one of our big ticket items when it comes to culture, and that is the language that you speak. So we're going to talk about the geography of language right now. Right, keep in mind there's almost 7,000 languages spoken in the world, but only 11 of them are spoken by 100 million people or more. So there are many languages, right? But many of these are being threatened, and many of them are going extinct. And we hear that sometimes that we lose a language every 2 weeks, that the last speaker dies. Right. So let's think about that. What keeps a language alive? What threatens a language and makes it become extinct? All right, language is a communication through speech. That's your definition. Often includes writing, doesn't always, right? It might just have an oral tradition and not a literary tradition. And then also note that many countries may designate official languages. For example, English is the official language in many countries, but not in the United States. All right, so there's our world languages, and we'll talk a little bit about our families, right, and our look. But we look and we see English and we see Mandarin and all of those. All right, so keep that in mind as we move through this. Top 10, right, spoken in the world: Mandarin Chinese. Keep in mind that you also have a different dialect of Chinese, Wu Chinese, which also is another 77 million, right? And from there we see Spanish, English, Hindi, which is in India, Portuguese, which is not just in Portugal but also in Brazil, Bengali, which is in Bangladesh, Russian, which is not just in Russia but has spread throughout a lot of Eastern European countries because of the Soviet Union, Japan, which has really stayed within the Japanese islands, Germany, which is not just Germany but also parts of Switzerland and Austria as well. And so you see these are our big top 10. All right, how has English diffused? Let's focus on English. This is the language we're speaking today, so let's focus a little bit on that. Right? It's an official language in 57 countries. It's the first language of over 300 million people, well over 300 million people, and it's spoken fluently by nearly a billion people. Right? So it's not the first language, but it is a second language, right, where people are able to understand it really well. All right, so let's talk about what is going on here and how English is very widespread, right? And that really has to do with British imperialism. So we're speaking English today because the Brits, right, diffused English to the American colonies in the 1600s. Ireland, South Asia, think India, right? Parts of Africa, South Africa, for example, Australia and New Zealand. These are all going to be English-speaking places because they were former British colonies. Right, the U.S. in turn has spread English to the Philippines and Puerto Rico through its own colonization and imperialism. So there's English as a predominant and an official language. You see it along in here, right? And we look at places like Nigeria and Sudan. It is not the official language there, but it is not the predominant language, right? Whereas here, United States, it is not the official language, but it is the predominant language. All right, so where and how did English originate? What is the history of English? How did it get to be such a messed up language? Right. So let's talk about the English Isles, right? The British Isles, if you will. England was originally inhabited by a group called the Celts, right? And they had that's the base of their language, right? The base of English is Celtic. However, a series of invasions then really shapes what English is like and how it is. All right, it involves early languages, Germanic groups. So we have the Germanic groups coming through, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes all come through, and they impose. So you have Celtic as your base, and then they impose Germanic flavor onto language. So you have a combination of two languages there, right? The Vikings then come through in 800 BCE. And they bring Northern Germanic as opposed to Western Germanic like the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. And then in 1066, you have the Norman invasion. All right, and William the Conqueror from France goes and invades the British Isles. And for 300 years, people in Britain are speaking French. And that has an influence as well. So you have this hodgepodge of influences, and that's what makes English so tricky. English is tricky because it has been influenced by so many various factors, right? Including a Romance language like French, and then two types of Germanic languages. You have the base of Celt, and all of a sudden, right, it makes it an incredibly hard language to learn. There are lots of different rules, but they're not always followed, and so it is a very unique language in that sense. All right, so there's your map of this. We see the 9th century. There's your Vikings coming through. There's your Anglo-Saxons and Jutes coming through in the 5th century. Before that, right, 1066. There's your Norman invasion. All right, and then you see Celt being pushed, right, and so eventually you're going to see Scottish, like Gaelic Scottish and Irish Gaelic and Welsh Gaelic and all those things being pushed a little further away. All right, so let's talk dialects, right? So we've talked about the history of English. Let's talk about dialects, right? So a dialect is a regional variation of language with the differences in 3 different things: spelling, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And you tend to think pronunciation first, right? We look at word use patterns and we look at speech patterns and all of those things. And so we have a nice term here called isogloss, which is where somebody starts speaking using one word and stops using another word. Right? So it's a word usage boundary. All right, so English dialects exist in various countries, right, but also in various regions of the United States. And you know this. You know that Southern people speak differently than East Coast people, and East Coast people speak differently than Midwest people. And then you have a Western accent, too, which isn't necessarily as pronounced. Right? And then also within the UK, you have the Highlands, you have the Northern and Southern different places. You have London is very different than other different places and how they speak. All right, question number 2. Both the Angles and the Normans contributed to the development of the English language because they A. spoke Germanic languages, B. invaded England, C. spoke languages derived from Latin, D. diffused English around the world, or E. agreed to divide England. And your answer to that is both of these groups invaded England. An isogloss, right, is a boundary between language regions. So, what's the difference between British English and American English? Okay, so again, we talk about the 3 different things. We talk about pronunciation, we talk about vocabulary, different words, and we talk about spelling. All right, so let's start with vocabulary. Right, when the Brits come over to the United States and time moves on, they're exposed to different objects, different experiences. Moose is a good example for that. Moose is something that moose don't exist in England, and so they had to come up with a new word for that one. All right, so you'll see different vocabulary, and then also think about how far away. The further away you get, the more something diffuses, the more isolated you get, and so you're going to see dialects appear. Right, the further away you get from the hearth of the English Isles. All right, spelling is another way. If you look down here, we talk about our OU color. Right, if you see OU color being spelled that way, it's pretty good. Chances are pretty good that it's not this, whatever you're reading is not coming from the United States. It's coming from somewhere else, because a guy named Noah Webster came up with a dictionary, right? Created a whole set of American spellings because he wanted to separate himself, Americans, from British, and so he created, in order to kind of forge a national identity, he created a whole new set of spellings that are shortened. We look at them and we see them, because we're reading in American English, we see them as as natural, right? But others aren't going to see it that way. All right, and then the last one we talk about is pronunciation, right? So differences as a result of isolation and then outside influence. So think about like the letter Z in England is pronounced Z. Aluminum is pronounced aluminium. You just have lots of different pronunciations. All right, so there's our American dialect map. Notice how big the West is. Notice that there is this kind of gray area too, that it's not perfect, right? We would belong in kind of the North, we see, but not the North Central. And I grew up in the North Central, so you're going to hear maybe a little bit of a Fargo accent from me, that I tend to elongate my O's a little bit, you betcha, right? That type of thing. So maybe you'll hear that, although I have been living in Minneapolis, St. Paul for longer than I've been living up there. Note that you have different accents within and dialects within the South, right? And East New England versus West New England versus Inland North. So think about a Maine accent versus a New York accent versus a Bostonian accent. I can't always hear them. Maybe you can hear them but if you lived in New York, you would understand that if somebody's speaking, you would understand in a Bostonian dialect, you would understand that they're from Boston, whereas we might just hear, oh, they're from the East Coast. All right. Also think in terms of vocabulary, that things change from place to place. So in the United States, 49 out of 50 states use the words duck, duck, goose to describe the game played by children, whereas we strong, hardy, smart Minnesotans use the only true way to say it, which is duck, duck, gray duck. Now, I grew up saying duck, duck, gray duck, but everybody else apparently grew up saying duck, duck, goose. So it's a fun thing to think about. How did what do you call it? And do you have, Wisconsin roots, or do you have roots from somewhere else? Or do your parents? What did your parents call it growing up? Chances are that's what you called it growing up. Other things we can look at, right? Regional variations in what we call soda or soft drinks, right? Or pop, right? We tend to be pop people. You see down south, they use the word Coke ubiquitously, so they would ask you what kind of Coke you want. On the east and west coasts, you're going to see soda a little bit more. So again, how do you say soft drink? Do you use pop or soda or Coke? All right. So British and American English differ in all but which of the following: alphabet, pronunciation, spelling, or vocabulary. And the answer to that is alphabet. That we do use the Roman alphabet, and we do not, but we spell things differently, we pronounce things differently, and we have different vocabulary. Right? Garbage instead of rubbish, something along those lines. And if you really want to dig into it, take a look at all the things that they call, all the different car parts that they use. They call a truck a lorry. They call the trunk a bonnet. All of these different things because cars existed when American and British were separated. All right, so there's a few links that you could click on: a dialect survey and which dialect do you speak. Right, these are kind of fun. They isolate kind of where you live. All right, let's talk quickly about language classification. We have language families, and then smaller groups within families are called branches, and smaller groups within branches are called groups, and then finally you have the language. All right. There are over 100 language families. We are not going to learn them all. We're going to talk about two of them. Most important are going to be Indo-European, which about 46% of all people who speak languages in the world speak an Indo-European language. And then the second one we look at is Sino-Tibetan, which is going to be Chinese. Right? It's gonna be East Asian. Other ones we look at: Afro-Asiatic, Austronesian, and Niger-Congo. These are some of the big ones, but we're really going to focus on the two biggest for now. All right. So how they're related to each other: you have an ancient ancestral language. At some point, there was one kind of Proto-Indo-European language. And then through isolation, it broke off, and they became different separate languages. They used to be dialects, and then they become separate languages, right? And then from there, there's more branching off and more branching off, right? And so you get a more recent ancestral language that all come together. And we'll talk a little bit about those in our next slide. And so we look at English as an example, a good example, and it says that here that it is from the Indo-European family, from the Germanic branch, and then from the West Germanic group, right? And if we slide down here, this is our Germanic branch, and there's our West Germanic group. There's also an East Germanic group and a North Germanic group, of which you're going to get, Scandinavian languages are in the north. Right, and we look here and we have this broken down maybe even a little bit further, and we look at English, and the nearest language that we see here is something called Frisian. And if you ever Google Frisian and you look at it, it really doesn't have anything. You really can't tell what it is. It's pretty far apart. So just keep in mind that even though they're your closest relative, doesn't mean that you're going to be able to understand it. There isn't mutual intelligibility there. All right, so there's our closest language. Here is our Indo-European tree, our biggest one, and then our second biggest one is Sino-Tibetan. All right, so other branches besides Germanic, there's the Indo-Iranian one, and that's where we get Hindi. Hindi comes from there. There's the Balto-Slavic one. You're going to see that in Eastern Europe, so Ukrainian and other Eastern European languages are going to be that. The biggest one in the Balto-Slavic branch is Russian. And then we have the Romance languages, and these evolved from Latin, from the Roman Empire. Right? And so at one point, the Roman Empire pretty much conquered all of Europe, and then it ceased to exist. And because of that, there was isolation. So what used to be Latin then evolved into, it became a local dialect, right? And then it got so far apart that the local dialects didn't understand each other, so they became separate languages, right? Spanish, for example, or French, or Italian, right? In Spanish, then the people who ended up in Portugal originally spoke Spanish, but that became a regional dialect, and then that became to the point where that broke off and became its own separate language too. All right, so again, the fall of Rome led to this isolation and differentiation in regions, and they stopped talking to each other, and so they evolved into different. They shifted from dialect into different languages. All right, there's your Indo-European branches. So again, we look at Indo-Iranian, right, in which we look at Hindi. We see our Balto-Slavic over here in the red. Here's our Germanic over here in the blue, and then we got our Romance languages here in green. There are some other ones which we won't get into quite as much now. All right, again, we look at, there's our branches. So there's your Indo-Iranian, Hindi, right? There's your Balto-Slavic, there's Russian up there. There's your Romance languages, in which you have French and Portuguese and Spanish. And then you have your West Germanic ones, which English and German are going to be the two big ones there. All right, our second family that we're going to look at is the Sino-Tibetan, right? And that's going to consist of, the Chinese languages. There is no single Chinese language, but the largest dialect is going to be Mandarin, right? And it is the most spoken language in the world. Keep in mind there are 1.3 billion people, and you have the Chinese government who really pushes that. All right, so there's your Mandarin over here. Again, we look at Arabic across the Muslim world. We see Romance languages here. We see English dominating these areas. Keep in mind that Canada also has some French, right? And then we go from there. All right, so which one is not a Romance language? Would that be Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, French, or German? And the answer to that is German. German is Germanic. The rest of them are Romance, from Rome. All right, so what happens when you have, generally speaking, most countries are divided by language, that it is a country tends to be monolingual. It tends to have only one language within its borders. But there are some multilingual countries, and that leads to some conflict. So we're going to talk about three of them today. First one is Belgium. Right? Belgium has two languages. One is Flemish, right, in the northern part, and then in the southern part, called Wallonia, they speak French, and that's the one that's closest to the French border. And these two do not get along. Right? There's an idea that in your lifetime, and I'm going to put this out there, in your lifetime, Belgium will become two countries. That's my theory. I can't prove it, but that's my guess. Right? And they're going to be two separate regions. They barely hold it together as it is. The only time they really get together is when their soccer team plays internationally. And then they kind of come together. But for the most part, the two regions don't like each other. There's regional conflict. There's economic conflict between the two. And there's definitely a language barrier. Right? And so that is a multilingual country that doesn't work real well. Switzerland, on the other hand, has 4 official languages, and they work quite nicely together. Now, think about where Switzerland is. It's right in the middle of Europe, so it's pretty good at compromising. It was neutral. It stayed out of World War II, for gosh sake, right? So it's pretty good at negotiation and compromise. And so what they do, they have French, Italian, German, and Romansh, which is a small little Romance language that you don't see many other places. German and Italian and French tend to dominate near the German, Italian, and French borders, right? You're going to see the language closer to the border, corresponding border. But they don't make anybody speak a language. The local governments will use German if it's in a German-dominated place, or Italian if it's in an Italian-dominated place. And so they tend to get along pretty well. Right? Canada is kind of a split the difference between these two. You have French and English spoken there, right? A quarter of Canadians speak French, but most of them are going to be in Quebec, right? And the Quebecois are different. They're a unique nationality. They tend to be dominated by Catholicism, and they speak French, whereas the rest of Greater Canada mostly speaks English and tends to be more Protestant in their religious practices, right? The government has helped bring these two groups together by making French mandatory, and so you see, right, the stop signs being in French and in English as well. But occasionally it flares up, and occasionally the Quebecois will ask to leave. They'll have a vote, and they haven't left Canada yet, right? But they could. That could come up. All right, so there's Flanders and Wallonia, the Flemish-speaking Flanders, and the French-speaking Wallonia, again closer to France here as well. And you see literally two advertisements that are the same, but are in different languages. One's in French and the other one's in Flemish. right? In Switzerland, you see, again, these different areas, and they tend to, again, hold it together. They do pretty well, right? And you'll see, again, multilingual places, signs there. All right, and lingua franca is another really important thing to think about in a language concept, right? And this is used by speakers of a different language to communicate. So English is going to be the biggest lingua franca in the world, but there are some others as well. So let's suppose um, you don't speak English, but you speak Spanish, and you want to talk to somebody, and you do speak a little bit of English, but it's not your native tongue. It's your second language, right? And you want to speak to somebody who's German who also knows some English. You would use English because that's the thing that you have in common, all right? And so it's a pretty important thing, right? English is used in global trade, right? It is the language of commerce. Air communication. Try to imagine if the pilots speak one language, but the air traffic control speaks another one. That could be a disaster, right? So English is the universal language of air communication as well, right? Other lingua francas that you see Spanish being spoken throughout Latin America, with the exception of Brazil. That most people will have a tribal language, but they'll also have Spanish. Swahili in East Africa, also the same way. You'll see tribal languages there, but Swahili is the overarching lingua franca there. Hindi in South Asia, that most people in India will have a language, a local language, but they'll speak Hindi, and they will also speak English because it was a British colony, right? And then Russian in the former Soviet Union states is a lingua franca. All right. Keep in mind that most people teach English as a second language. Most places do that. We do not because we already speak English. All right. Last thing we look at, how languages are affected by the spread of English. We have Spanglish as a good example of that. That it's a Spanish-English mix. You're going to see that in convergence zones. You're going to see it where you see a lot of Spanish speakers and a lot of English speakers where they're widely mixed. And so you'll see this. This is the language of the young. It's a way of easing things. All right, so the word for to rent has shifted. It used to, the word in Spanish. I don't know the word in Spanish, but now people tend to use rentar, right? Which is Spanglish. So you're going to see this, pretty well spread out. The French also have something called Franglais. The German English mix is called Denglisch for Deutsch and English together. All right, so what language do most MDCs in the world teach as a second language? That is going to be English. All right, you do not need to summarize, so that is our notes for today.